excited the fears of the king and his people. And he says, if there's a war, these people will join with our enemies, and then we will be defeated. So many of these Israelites were people of understanding and great workmanship. And they added to the economy and to the great wealth of Egypt. And the king needed these people and these laborers for the erection of the magnificent palaces and the temples. But over a period of time, they began to put taskmasters over the Israelites. They were set up over them, and now they became slaves in a nation where they had been considered a great asset to the nation. After that 90-some years or more, now we find that they are in servitude. And so in verse 11, it says, therefore they did set over them taskmasters, to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. And the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in bricks and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. The king and his counselors had hoped to subdue the Israelites with this hard labor, and thus also decrease their numbers and crush out this independent, separatist spirit. But failing to accomplish their purpose, they now proceed to even more cruel measures. Since the oppression and the hard labor's not doing it, orders were issued now to the midwives, to the Hebrew women who assisted in giving birth, to destroy all of the Hebrew male children at their birth. And behind this was Satan himself. He knew that a deliverer was to be raised up among the Israelites, and by leading the king to destroy their children, he had hoped to defeat God's divine purpose. This is the same thing that he attempted centuries later when working through Herod. He tried to destroy all of the children in the area of Bethlehem to stop the great deliverer from coming on the scene. And so, as the account continues on in verse 15, it says, the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. Great desire to destroy them. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. You see, the women, these Hebrew women, the midwives, feared God, and they dared not execute this cruel mandate upon these small babies. And so the Lord approved their course, and the Lord began to prosper the midwives. And as a result, the king himself became very angry at the failure of his design, and he made the commandment even more urgent than it was. And now he calls upon the whole nation to hunt out and to slaughter these helpless victims. In verse 20, he says here, in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 20, therefore God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So now he calls upon the whole nation. Any Hebrew boy you find, throw him in the river. Let the little girls live, but throw them, the boy and children, in the river. And while this decree was in full force, that all the male children were to be put to death, a young man and a young woman, Amram and Jochebed, devout Israelites of the tribe of Levi, were to bring forth a son into that type of a setting. And notice now in chapter 2, it says, "And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and dabbed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off, to wit what would be done to him." You see, Amram and Jochebed believed fully that the time of Israel's release was drawing very near, and that God would raise up a deliverer for his people. And they were determined that their little one would not die. And faith in God strengthened their hearts, and the account tells us in Hebrews 11 that they were not afraid of the king's commandment. I want you to take just a moment. Don't lose your place in Exodus, but go to Hebrews a moment and see how Paul describes this event that's taking place here. Hebrews chapter 11. Who can tell me what Hebrews chapter 11 is called?
Faith.
The faith chapter. Notice the faith that is portrayed in the 11th chapter of Hebrews in talking about these people, the parents of Moses and Moses himself, beginning in verse 21. Hebrews 11, verse 21. It says, "By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel, and gave commandment concerning his bones. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned." Quite an account there, just in those few verses of what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. You see, Jochebed succeeded in concealing Moses for 3 months. Anybody knows the bigger a child gets, the more noise a child can make. And after a while, those little whimpers and little cries were becoming such that they could not keep him hid safely any longer. And so she goes out trusting in God and prepares this little basket, this ark of rushes, making it watertight by using slime and pitch. And then she took her son, her youngest son, and put him in that little basket and placed it among the flags or the reeds by the water's edge. The mother didn't dare to remain there to guard it, lest the child's life and her own should be forfeited. But what she did was have the sister, Miriam, to linger nearby and to observe what was taking place. And so the sister, apparently indifferent to what was going on there, anxiously watched to see what would become of her little brother. But besides Miriam, there were other watchers present there. You know, as I've been in Egypt and gone across that bridge and seen where the supposed place that Moses was put in the river is, it's quite an interesting little island thing that or peninsula thing that juts out there. And I can kind of imagine Miriam, a young girl, a little girl, you know, probably in her, 9, 10, somewhere in through there. And she's there in the brush, walking along, watching from a distance. And she sees her little brother floating along there, kind of slowly in the sides there in those flags. But the angels were there too, unseen by anyone, because Jochebed's earnest prayers had committed her baby boy to the care of God. And these unseen angels hovered in that area. And then those angels directed Pharaoh's daughter to the spot where the basket was. And her curiosity was excited by this little basket with these little noises coming out of it. And so she opened it up and looked in upon this beautiful little child. And immediately she could tell the whole story. Some mother trying to save her son. The tears of the infant awakened her compassion. And her sympathies went out to an unknown mother who had resorted to this means to preserve the life of her little boy. And that woman, Pharaoh's daughter, determined that that child would be saved and that she would adopt him as her own son. But the story gets really great here. Watch what happens in verse 5. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." See, immediately she knew. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give you wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. You see, Miriam, staying in the background, was watching. And as soon as she saw the expression on the face of that princess, as soon as she saw that woman take that baby out and hug him, little Miriam comes out. And she says, "Shall I find somebody to nurse the child?" You know, there was no formula in those days. No Enfamil. "I'll go find somebody." "Oh yes, go see who you can find for me." And with her heart leaping, she goes to her mother and says, "Mom, they need somebody to nurse Moses. They need somebody," well, he didn't even have the name Moses yet. "They need somebody to nurse little brother. And they told me to come and find somebody. Come on, Mom, let's go see what they're going to do." And I can see Miriam just trying to restrain herself, because I know she wanted to be jumping up and down like a little child. She's going to be able to get her child back? Could this be possible? And so she gets there, and not only was she going to be able to nurse the child, but the woman tells her, I'll pay you to take care of this baby. Does God provide or what? I'll pay you to take care of this little child for me. You see, God had heard Jochebed's prayer, and her faith had been rewarded. It was with deep gratitude that she now entered safe and happy into the job of taking care of her little boy. She faithfully improved her opportunities to educate her child for God. And she felt confident that Moses had been preserved for some great work, and she knew that he must soon be given up to his royal mother, to be surrounded with all of the influences of Egypt that would tend to lead him away from the true God of heaven. And so she knew she had a work before her. And all of this rendered her more diligent and careful in the instruction than in the rest of her children. This was an important task that needed to be taken care of in a short period of time, whereas she would have Miriam and Aaron for a long while. So she endeavored to imbue the mind of Moses with the fear of God and with the love of truth and justice, and earnestly prayed continually that he might be preserved from all of the corrupting influences that he was going to be surrounded by. She showed her son the folly and the sin of idolatry. And from them early years, she taught him not to bow down and pray to anyone but the living God, who alone could hear him and help him in every emergency. She kept her son with her for as long as she could. But eventually she was required to give him up when he was about 12 years old. Give him back to Pharaoh. And so from his humble beginnings in his home, he is now taken from that home at about 12 to a royal palace, to the daughter of Pharaoh, to become her son. Exodus 2 and verse 10 now tells us, and the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him out of the water. You know, in reality, we call this guy by his nickname. I don't think anybody knows his real name. That name that she gave him was not the name that Jochebed had given him. He didn't get this name until he was 12 years old. And she says, this is what you're going to be called. So now he's in the palace. And even here, he did not lose the impressions received in his childhood. The lessons learned at his mother's side could not be forgotten. They were a shield from the pride and from the infidelity and the vice that flourished in the splendor of the court of the most powerful ruler in the world. How far-reaching in its results was the influence of that one Hebrew woman, and that woman herself an exile and a slave. Oftentimes we don't give a lot of thought to the due that should be given to Jochebed, to what she did in those first few years. The whole future life of Moses, the great mission which he fulfilled as the leader of Israel, testifies to the importance of the work of the Christian mother. There is no work on earth greater than that work. But oh, how few understand that. how few raise their children in the nurture and in the admonition of the Lord. To a very great extent, the mother holds in her hands the destiny of her children, more so even than the father. She is dealing with developing minds and characters and working not alone for time, but for eternity. The mother is sowing the seed that will spring up and bear fruit, either for good or for evil. She is to impress upon a human soul the very image of the divine that was lost through sin. And especially during the early years of the child, the responsibility rests upon her of forming the characters of her children. The impressions that are now made upon their developing minds will remain with them through all their life. And so parents should direct the instruction and the training of their children while very young, to the end that they may truly be Christians. Parents are placed in an awesome thing, in an awesome situation, because God entrusts in our care His children to be trained, not as heirs to the throne of an earthly empire, but as kings and priests unto God, to reign with Him throughout the endless ages. And every mother here today, my friends, needs to feel that her moments are priceless. You need to know that your work will be tested in the solemn day of reckoning. For in that day it will be found that many of the failures and crimes of men and women have resulted from the ignorance and neglect of those mothers whose duty it was to guide the feet of these little ones in the right way. And then it will be found that many who have blessed the world with the light of genius and truth and holiness owe these very principles that were the mainspring of their influence and success to a praying Christian mother. So now, without his mother, he's got his stepmom. At the court of Pharaoh, Moses begins to receive the highest civil and military training that there was. The monarch had determined to make his adopted grandson his successor to the throne, and the youth was educated and prepared for this high station. He was being prepped to become the most powerful ruler in the world. Acts chapter 7 tells us that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. His notoriety was universal at that time. Everybody knew of this great Egyptian priest, the mightiest of the warriors, the most educated, highly skilled person within the civilized world at that time. His ability as a military leader made him a favorite with the armies of Egypt, and he was generally regarded as one with a remarkable character. Moses stood out from the pagans about him. Satan had been defeated in his purpose. For the very decree condemning the Hebrew children to death had been overruled by God for the training and education of the future leader of his people. And now Moses was being prepared. The elders of Israel, it's interesting that when we really look at inspiration, we find out that even those elders were being taught by angels that the time for their deliverance was near, and that Moses was the man whom God would employ to accomplish this work. So the leaders there in servitude were instructed that that's the man that's going to deliver you. It's a little bit different than Cecil D. DeMille and Charlton Heston portray it. But they knew these things, and angels even instructed Moses also that Jehovah had chosen him to break the bondage of his people. And so Moses, supposing that they were to obtain their freedom by force of arms, expected to lead the Hebrew host against the armies of Egypt, and having this in view, he guarded his affections, lest his attachment to his foster family would prevent him from being free to do the will of God. Now you know, by the laws of Egypt, all who occupied the throne of the Pharaohs must become members of the priestly caste. And Moses, as the apparent heir, was to be initiated into the mysteries of the national religion. And that duty had been committed to the priest. But while he was an ardent and untiring student, Moses could not be induced to participate in the worship of those gods. He was threatened with the loss of the crown. He was warned that he would be disowned by the princes and by the Pharaoh if he should persist in his adherence to the Hebrew faith. But he was unshaken in his determination to render homage to no one but God, the maker of heaven and earth. And Moses reasoned with the priests and the worshipers, showing the folly of their superstitious veneration of senseless objects. And none of them could refute his arguments or change his purpose. Yet for the time his firmness was tolerated on account of that high position and the favor with which he was regarded by both the king and the people. We saw in Hebrews that by faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater than riches, than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect under the recompense of the reward. Moses looked far beyond the temporal into the eternal. And so he was now fitted to take preeminence among the great of the earth, to shine in the courts of the most glorious kingdom, and to sway the scepter of power. His intellectual greatness distinguished him from all of the great men of the ages. He was a historian. He was a poet. He was a philosopher. By the way, have you ever read any of Moses' poetry? I'm glad some of you know that it's there in Psalms. He was a historian. He was a poet. He was a philosopher. He was the general of armies. He was a legislator. And he stands without a peer in the history of the world. Yet with the world before him, this man had the moral courage and strength to refuse the flattering prospects of wealth and greatness and fame, choosing the better way. If Moses had chosen back then, he could have gone that way, and you could probably go see him today as a mummy in some museum. But Moses is not a mummy, and Moses is not dead. Moses was a representative of Christ, and Moses is a representative of all of those who will die and be raised back to life. Amen. Moses had been instructed in regard to the final reward to be given to the humble and obedient servants of God. And when he understood those things, worldly gain sank into its proper insignificance. The magnificent palace of Pharaoh and the monarch's throne were held out as an inducement to Moses. But he knew that the sinful pleasures that make men forget God were in those lordly courts. Remember, that's even what the devil tried to use on Jesus. you will but bow down and worship me, you'll be over all of these kingdoms. Moses looked beyond the palace, beyond the crown, to the high honors that were bestowed upon the saints of the Most High in the kingdom that is untainted by sin. He saw by faith an imperishable crown that the King of heaven would place upon the brow of the overcomer. And this faith led him to turn away from the lordly ones of the earth and join the humble, poor, despised nation that had chosen to obey God rather than to serve sin. Friends, I would encourage you to earnestly study through these next few chapters and take a look at this life and how God used him, how God preserved him. Moses trusted God, and God was faithful to deliver and preserve his servant for 120 years. And we've got 120 years of life we're going to be looking at in this series.